Yo, what's up guys, Ouphe here, and today I'm going to be doing a set review for Wilds of Eldraine for Alchemy, and also just a general discussion about rotation, because we're kind of in a weird situation this year where Standard is not going to be rotating, but Alchemy will be. So with the release of Wilds of Eldraine next week on the 5th, Alchemy is going to be rotating. So what I'm going to do in this video is, at the start, I'm just going to have a general discussion about rotation. I basically picked out a bunch of high impact cards that are going to be leaving the format to give you a better idea of what the format might look like after rotation, and then I'm going to be doing the set review after that. Picked out any cards from the spoiler that I think are likely to see play or have applications. So if you're not interested in the discussion about rotation, I'll leave a timestamp down in the description if you just want to skip straight ahead to the set review. But anyway, let's just get straight into it. So as I mentioned, Standard is going to be rotating, but Alchemy is going to be leasing these four main sets. This page I'm on right now is the MTG Zone page about Alchemy rotation that has all the details. So I'll leave a link to this down in the description if you want to check it out in more detail. But the sets that we're going to be losing if we scroll down here is Midnight Hunt, Crimson Vow, Neon Dynasty, Streets of New Capenna, the Alchemy sets for Innistrad, Kamigawa, and New Capenna, and the Alchemy Horizons Baldur's Gate set, which is kind of crazy. It doesn't feel like that long ago to me that this set was added to the format, but already going to be rotating. So with this, there's going to be a lot of high impact cards rotating, and I think the biggest ones that are likely to have the most impact are the lands here. So I think the two biggest land cycles that we're losing with rotation is all of the slow lands like Deserted Beach here, and the triomes that we got in New Capenna, like Spara's Headquarters. So I think this is likely to have a very big impact on the format, because we are getting some new dual lands, but they're tapped lands and they're creature lands. So a lot of decks, will probably have to run them to enable the 2-color mana base, but it will slow the decks down in general. Obviously the slow lands aren't great in something like aggro, but still having them come into play untapped later in the game is a huge deal. So losing the slow lands will definitely be a big hit to 2-color decks in general. I think 2-color decks are generally going to become less consistent with the loss of the slow lands. I think bigger issue than that, though, is going to be for the 3 or 4-color decks. We've regularly seen in Alchemy decks fairly easily being able to go into 3 or 4 colors. With the loss of the slow lands, and particularly the triomes, I think that's going to be a lot more difficult now. Now, the two exceptions to that, I think, are probably the legend decks. I think a deck like 5-color Joda is still going to be viable because of lands like Plaza of Heroes and the Citadel land, and also potentially 3-color decks that have 2 fast lands. So for example, Grixis has the black-red fast land and the blue-black fast land. So I think there's a chance that certain decks could still move into 3 colors, but I think losing these dual lands is going to be a big hit to consistency for those multicolored decks, and by extension, I think probably like an indirect buff to monocolored decks as well. On top of that, an even bigger blow to the multicolored decks, we're also losing Forsaken Crossroads, which was basically a staple in any multicolored deck. So this is going to be another big hit, making these multicolored decks even worse. And then we also lose the channel cycle of lands, which isn't really a big, isn't as much of an issue for the multicolored decks, but it does mean that the mana base is going to have less extra utility. As I mentioned, we are going to be getting some new creature lands in the format, but the channel lands were always really, really useful. So I think the mana bases in general are going to become a lot worse post-rotation, which is definitely going to have a big impact on the format. So outside of the lands, a lot of the other cards that are going to be rotating, I'm just going to quickly go through now. So first of all, we've got Omnicult Anvil, Bloodtide Harvester, and Ob Nixilis. So unfortunately, the Anvil deck, one of my favourite decks to play in the format ever since I started playing, is going to be leaving the format. So that archetype is going to be leaving. Bloodtide Harvester and Ob are also just good mid-range tools that are going to be leaving the format. So Black-Red does lose some options there as well. On top of that, with the mid-range game plan, we've got Invoke Despair going out of the format. Now, Invoke Despair hasn't really been that popular since Bowmasters was printed, but it's been such a high impact card in Alchemy for a very long time. I thought it was worth mentioning. We're also losing Agent of Rafine, which is going to be a blow to the Dimir and Sultai decks. Those kind of more reactive Siphon Insight Make Disappear decks is going to be a loss for those. Minsc and Boot, another card that doesn't see a ton of play, but was always a very scary top end threat. Going to be losing this one as well. So less options at the top end of the red-green decks. Assemble from Parts was a really very powerful reanimation tool. So I think we are getting a reanimation spell that I'm going to be talking about a little bit later, but being able to reanimate on turn 3 with this was incredibly strong, and so losing that is going to be a blow for Reanimator. I mean, having said that, Reanimator did lose a lot of good discard outlets, but this is definitely another notable loss for sure. Then in terms of counter spells, we're losing both Bind to Secrecy and Make Disappear, which has been a huge card in the format. So again, alongside Agent of Rafine, this is another big blow to the blue-black decks. Having said that, we are getting another Quench style effect in the new set, but it's tied to Faeries, which I'm not really sure is going to be good enough, but I'll discuss that a little bit later on. We're also losing Cabaretti Revels, which again hasn't seen a ton of play recently, but has been a very powerful card at multiple times in Alchemy, so another notable loss there. We're also losing Cursebound Witch and Shambling Ghast, which I'm only really bringing up because they were both quite important cards in the most recent deck that I've posted. Now, having said that, I think a very similar build with Beseech the Mirror is going to be viable, so not a massive loss there, but I thought it was worth noting there as well. Also losing Inquisitor Captain, which is going to be a bit of a blow to the Nazgul decks as well as Humans, although Humans hasn't been that popular since Bowmasters came out. Another, just generically powerful card that we're using is Lae'zel, which, has seen a decent amount of play recently, so definitely another notable one leaving. We're also losing Molten Impact, which was a very, very high impact card against aggro decks. And speaking of which, another card that was very, very good against aggro decks, particularly go-wide decks it's leaving, is Tasha. So there's a chance that the go-wide aggro decks, Bowmasters is still going to be about, as is Shieldred, so I'm not optimistic about aggro, but these were two very good tools against it. And Tasha was also very good against Reanimator strategies as well, so losing this is going to be an indirect buff to Reanimator in a sort of way as well. Then we're also losing Settle the Wilds, which I'm only really bringing up because of the Croaky's ramp deck that's been doing very well recently. I think losing the, certain number of lands might be more of a blow to this deck than Settle the Wilds, but definitely worth noting for that deck as well. We're also losing the Hourglass Coven, which is just another mid-range threat that's been played quite a lot over time. Not seen as much play recently, but another notable loss. Then in terms of Graveyard Hate, we're losing both Viconia and Unlicensed Hirsch, which is a pretty big deal because these have been very consistently my Graveyard Hate of choice throughout the format, so I'm definitely going to have to start looking for other options when these two rotate out. We're losing Will, Packbound Duelist, which is a very, very strong card against the Ring decks. One of my big concerns going forwards is that the Ring, Shieldred, Bowmasters decks are going to be the centerpiece of the format, and Will was a really effective tool against those decks, so losing Will is going to be a bit of a blow to be able to combat the Ring. We're also losing Farewell, which again wasn't seeing a ton of play. I think Sunfall was more popular, and that card is going to be sticking around, so White still has access to a good XL-based sweeper, which is going to be a big deal against stuff like 5-color Joda, but losing Farewell, I'm honestly pretty happy to see this card go. It's kind of miserable to play against, but maybe that's because I'm an only Cult Anvil player, and it just absolutely hoses my deck, right? And then, in addition to Will, two other cards that I'm kind of worried about leaving the format in terms of the Ring is Pithing Needle and Rite of Oblivion. I think Pithing Needle specifically is a very big loss to the format because this was a really good option in the sideboard for any deck to have to be able to combat the Ring if you're not running it yourself. So losing Pithing Needle does mean that a lot of colours might not have good access to answers for the Ring, which is very much a concern because with a bunch of powerful other options leaving the format and Ring Shieldred staying in, I am worried that is going to take over the format. And then additionally, Rite of Oblivion is another tool I've been using recently to exile the Ring that we're going to be losing with rotation as well. So again, a little bit concerned about losing a lot of answers to the Ring, and this card has proved very effective, especially recently in decks I've been trying out. And then the last notable card that I wanted to talk about was Wedding Announcement. Again, not a card that's seen a ton of play in Alchemy, but was definitely a very powerful option for the White deck. So those are the main cards that I wanted to highlight. As you can see, we are losing a lot of big options, but as I mentioned, I think the biggest deal really is going to be these lands leaving the format. Like I mentioned, I think multicolored decks are going to be less effective, less consistent. If you end up needing to run the tap lands, that's going to be a big deal. In terms of the lands that are remaining in the format, we do get to keep the Pain lands, which does mean that, we have untapped dual lands for every colour pair, which is important. And then we also have the fast lands, but we only have the allied fast lands, right? We only have the red-black one, the blue-black one, etc. So enemy-coloured aggro decks, I think, are basically going to be unplayable. As I mentioned, we are getting the new creature lands, which are in enemy colours. But again, they're tap lands, so I just don't think enemy-coloured aggro is going to be viable. And to be honest, I'm not even sure that two-colour aggro in general is going to be viable, even in the allied coloured pairs, because we just don't really have good enough dual lands, and having to run a bunch of basics does cause issues with the aggro decks as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the aggro decks are very focused on mono-coloured initially anyway. But anyway, those are the cards I wanted to highlight to do with rotation. Now let's jump into the set review. So just like the historic set review, I'm going to be starting off here with Beseech the Mirror, which I think is probably going to be the most high-impact card from the latest set. Very, very powerful effect if you can consistently enable the bargain. Now, I do think that there are a decent number of deck building restrictions with this card. I think you really need to be consistently enabling the bargain on this. Even in Alchemy, I don't think 4 mana tutor to your hand is good enough. You really want to be getting the card in play. And obviously triple black is a huge deck building restriction in terms of the colours as well. As I mentioned, we are losing a lot of the good dual lands, so I think, you know, I'm initially going to be testing this in mono black. I do think you could potentially splash a second colour, but I think it would have to be a very light splash, and you probably couldn't afford to be running that many cheap cards in the off colour as well, because you need 21 black sources in your deck to consistently be casting this on turn 4, which doesn't leave very much room for enough sources of your off colour, particularly when we are losing the slow lands and Forsaken Crossroads as well. So I think I'm going to be starting with mono black with this, and kind of unsurprisingly, the main thing we're going to be looking to do with this is consistently tutor the One Ring into play. The last deck guide I posted in Alchemy was using Diabolic Intent just to consistently tutor the ring, because I feel like the ring decks, their biggest sticking point is when they have the ring, the deck is just nuts, and when they don't, it's not as powerful. So having Beseech just to give you extra redundancy to find the ring is huge, and you know, Diabolic Intent felt really good as a way to consistently find the ring, and I think Beseech the Mirror is just way better at doing that. So, you know, particularly with the format getting powered down a lot by rotation, Beseech tutoring the One Ring is going to be a thing that I think a lot of people are going to be trying to do. And the other really nice thing about it is that we can also just use it to tutor stuff like Shieldred if we already have the One Ring in play. We can sacrifice a One Ring if it's in play and dealing us too much damage to tutor up another one. And because Beseech actually casts the card that you tutor, you do get the protection as well. So I do expect Beseech decks to be very popular with the One Ring, with Shieldred. And then the other really great thing about it as well is that it also just gives you great access to tutor targets as well. Now again, I don't think you want to go too overboard with tutor targets in the main deck, but getting access to a bunch of silver bullets out the sideboard is going to be really nice. And I think it would be completely reasonable, even if you're in mono black, to run off-color cards in your sideboard to tutor off Beseech. And that seems like a really interesting dynamic as well, because the really nice thing about Beseech is it could give you access to colors that you're not normally able to run in mono black decks. So I'm definitely going to be testing that out. And I am, as I mentioned a few times, a little bit concerned that Beseech, One Ring, Shieldred, Bowmasters decks are just going to be the best thing to do in the format. Now, having said that, you do need to consistently enable the bargain, so you do need to be running a number of cards that you can sacrifice to this, but I think there's enough good bargain enablers in this set that that's going to be viable. You know, speaking of which, I think Hopeless Nightmare is a reasonable card on its own right, but if you're running bargain stuff like Beseech the Mirror, I think this is a really good way to enable that. You know, getting this down on turn 1, force the opponent to discard a card. Now, that effect on its own isn't that great, but just being an enchantment that gets you value when it enters play, that is also just great to sacrifice the Beseech the Mirror, because you get the Scry 2 when it dies as well. Seems like a nice addition to the deck if you're, you know, if you're a little bit low on bargain enablers. This seems like a really great addition. Another card that could potentially slot into the deck as well, that is also a bargain payoff, so if you are running a lot of bargain enablers, this is a nice one as well, is Back for Seconds, which is really, really strong if you can consistently use this to get back a creature with mana value 4 or less to the battlefield. Obviously, the one that, you know, you're ideally going to be getting back is Shieldred. Obviously, if you're running One Ring, you're going to be running Shieldred as well. So if you can use this to get back a Shieldred to the battlefield and like a Bowmasters or another creature back to your hand, this is really good on rate. As I mentioned in a historic video, my main concern with Back for Seconds in this sort of shell is that if you're running Beseech the Mirror, I imagine that you're going to be running 4 Beseech, 4 One Ring, and probably only 1 Shieldred, because you really can't afford to run that many 4-drops, or the curve of your deck is going to be really clunky. So I'm not sure how impactful Back for Seconds is going to be with only 1 Shieldred in the deck, but if you're running a deck with a lot of 4-drop creatures, this seems like a really strong card for 3 mana if you can consistently enable the bargain. So definitely one I'm going to be trying out anyway. Then next up we've got Experimental Confectioner, which is basically a new combo enabler with Peregrine Took. Now, I mentioned this one in the historic video as well, but I think this is going to be way more impactful in Alchemy because the power level of the format is lower. So having an infinite combo like this, where both cards are just reasonable on their own, seems really nice. Now, the way the combo works, if you're not familiar with it, basically, if you can get these both in play alongside 3 foods, you can sacrifice 3 foods to draw a card with the Peregrine Took, which then triggers the Experimental Confectioner to put 3 1/1s in play, which then also, because of Peregrine Took, puts 3 foods in play. So you're basically back to square one, but you've drawn a card and put 3 rats in play. So essentially, you could just draw your whole deck and put as many rats in play as you have cards in your deck, or I guess, 3 rats in play for each card that you have remaining in your deck, which is really, really powerful. There aren't that many sweepers seeing play right now. We've seen from the Scurry Oak combo in Historic that making a bunch of, making essentially infinite tokens is often good enough to win the game. And even if the opponent does have a board sweeper, you get to draw through your whole deck to basically sculpt your hands to have a really strong play the following turn. Now, obviously, the big weakness of this is that drawing cards when Bonemasters and Shielded are very popular is risky, but this combo seems strong enough that I'm definitely going to be trying it out. Now, in Historic, I was very excited with this combo alongside Samwise with Collected Company and Chord of Calling. Obviously, in Alchemy, we don't have Chord of Calling or Collected Company, but I think this could potentially be another shell where you could maybe run Beseech the Mirror, because if you're running food enablers and stuff, that's a very good way to have the bargain online. You could also run the One Ring as just a generic 4-drop that you can get with it as well. And other potential options that you could run off Beseech that I think work very well with the combo is Knight of the Sweet Revenge and Elven Chorus. So Knight of the Sweet Revenge is another card that is from the new set. So basically what it does is it turns all of your food tokens into mana rocks, producing a ton of mana if you have multiple ways to produce food. And so if you combine this with Elven Chorus and you're running a very creature-heavy deck, you can basically storm off. If you have a bunch of creatures that produce food, you could potentially storm off. Now, the downside of this is that we don't actually have that many good food enablers in Alchemy. I think the best one is Samwise, and as I mentioned, 3-color decks are going to be very difficult to build with the mana base that we have at the moment, so maybe that's not a great way to build a deck. And also, there are some other enablers for food. For example, there's the 1-mana card that gets you a basic land and a food token in play, but I'm not sure that works particularly well with Elven Chorus because you need a lot of creatures, so it'll be interesting to see how the optimal way to build this deck. I think there's a reasonable chance that the best way to do it is to just run some good food enablers alongside the Confectioner and the Took, and just run Beseech the Mirror with Ring and Shielded as well. Now, again, it would kind of be disappointing if the whole format just evolves into Beseech, One Ring, Shielded, but from a purely competitive standpoint, I think that is probably the most efficient way to build it. But I wanted to mention Knight of Sweet Revenge and Elven Chorus because it is a really nice synergy if you've got a very creature-heavy deck. And next up, we've got Troublemaker Ouphe, which is a very interesting option if you can enable the bargain as another way to remove the ring. Now, we're still going to keep Haywire Might in the format, so I think most decks are probably going to be more interested in Haywire Might as an answer to the ring because it doesn't require any setup at all. But if you're running a deck with a lot of bargain enablers, this does seem pretty reasonable because you do get to keep the creature in play as well. So thought it was worth mentioning because it is a nice alternative to Haywire Might as an answer to the ring. Then next up we got Mosswood Dreadknight, which seems like a very, very generically powerful card. I think this has potential to see play in Explorer and maybe even Historic as well. And I think it is going to be a decent mid-range card in Alchemy as well. Now, the downside of this is it does draw a card, which, in a Bonemaster's Shielded format is a little risky, but I think this is generically powerful enough, and I think it's going to be slotting into mid-range decks, either green-black or potentially Jund. Again, not sure if Jund is going to be viable because of the mana base issues, but even in green-black mid-range, you're going to be having a lot of creature removal in your deck probably anyway, so that gives you answers to the Bonemasters or Shieldred to allow you to then get good use out of Dreadknight. If you are on Golgari mid-range, you still have access to the ring because it's, mono-coloured. So I do think Dreadknight is going to be a really nice addition to these sort of mid-range decks. Again, probably going to have to be in green-black in order to make use of it. But I think that's a reasonable mid-range colour combination to be in because, Crucius is a lot worse than it used to be. We've lost Fable as well, and green does have the best answers to the opposing One Rings, so I think green-black mid-range could be a potential way that these sort of One Ring decks develop into, and Dreadknight is going to be a nice tool for those sorts of decks as well. Then next up we've got a card I'm very excited for, which is Lich-Knights Conquest. So this is essentially a 5-mana reanimation spell that can reanimate multiple creatures if you have a lot of bargain enablers in play. So the thing that I'm most excited about with this is alongside the land cyclers, so stuff like the Troll of Khazad Doom here, or Generous Ent or Oliphant potentially. These are really nice because they're cards that are powerful to reanimate, that you can get into the graveyard in the early game to just give you lands. And then, the annoying thing about these is that you never really want to use a single reanimation spell to get them back because they are pretty powerful, but they're not as good as something like an Atraxa or an Atali, for example. But if you're able to get multiple of them out the graveyard, you can fairly easily fill the graveyard with these if you're running a high number of them. So I'm very excited to try out a deck that has a lot of enablers for the Lich-Knights Conquest and a lot of the land cyclers. Now, the slightly annoying thing about the land cyclers is if you did want to run a high number of them, say you wanted to run Jund for the Troll Oliphant, and Generous Ent. Because we're losing the Triomes, we don't have any way outside of dual tap lands for the Troll to get us a red land, for example, to actually work as mana fixing. I think there are some lands still in the format that are tapped dual lands that count as like a swamp and a mountain, but using these land cyclers to find tap lands isn't the best. So that's the main sticking point for this deck. I'll have to try and work through that one. If we still had like Zeotora's Proving Ground in the format or something, then I think that issue would basically be non-existent. But either way, I'm really excited to try this out, and I do think Land Cyclers plus Lich-Knights Conquest could be a really nice synergy that's worth building around. And then next up we've got the Irencrag, which is the first 2-mana rock that we're getting in the format, which is a pretty big deal, I think. You know, we haven't seen this in the format before. Ramping in any colour is going to be really huge, and I also think this is going to be potentially very nice with Beseech the Mirror. I think in decks that want to run Bargain Enablers, you know, the other issue with Beseech the Mirror, as I kind of alluded to earlier, was that it very heavily incentivizes you to run a lot of 4-drops. You kind of want to run the 4-1 ring, you definitely want to run the 4 Beseech the Mirror, you probably want to run 1 Shielded as well, and there's a chance that you might also want to run some other 4-mana or 3-mana cards to get utility off it in other situations. And the Irencrag is really nice because not only is it an artifact that you can sacrifice to Beseech, but it also enables you to ramp into your 4-mana plays on turn 3 as well. So the drawback is that it's legendary, obviously, so I don't know if you could run the full 4 copies, but I think at least 2 or 3 seems very nice alongside Beseech. Now, in terms of the other upside, you know, I think this is basically just going to be a 2-mana rock. The extra text on this might come up if you put a Shielded in play, for example, but for the most part, you're mainly just interested in the rock side. And I do expect this to see play, at least with Beseech. And as I mentioned, you know, 2-mana rock is a very, very big deal. The fact that you can get ramp in any colour is huge, so I wouldn't be surprised if this sees play in a few other different homes as well. The next up, we've got Torch the Tower, which is a really interesting card because it's essentially, well, it's not as good as Voltage Surge, because it only deals 3 instead of 1, although it does get you a Scry 1, but Voltage Surge is another card that's going to be rotating, so if you're interested in a 1-mana removal spell in red that kills creatures like Delighted Halfling in the early game that can scale up a little bit once you get Bargain Enablers in play, this does seem like a really nice tool there. So if you're running a red deck with Bargain Enablers, this seems like a really nice removal spell to have in your arsenal for sure. So next up we've got Bramble Familiar, which is a really cool mana dork because traditionally the big issue with mana dorks is that they're very good on curve but just really, really bad to draw later in the game. And this is a really cool one because it's a mana dork that is good on curve. You know, it has 2 toughness, so it passes the Bowmaster's test, which is a big deal. But it also acts as a payoff as well. You know, 7 mana is a little overcosted for the sorcery, but the flexibility on this card is huge. To give you ramp in the early game and then give you a payoff once you do have access to a lot of mana is really big. And then on top of that, you can also bounce it back to your hand. So, you know, if the game does go long and you do have access to a lot of mana, you can turn this from kind of a dead mana dork on the battlefield into a really powerful top-end threat in your hand. So if mono green is a deck, and you know, I wouldn't be surprised if it is viable because, as I mentioned, with the changes to the lands, I think monocolored decks do get kind of an indirect buff, and mono green can still cast the 1 ring, right? This enables you to cast the 1 ring on turn 3, which is a pretty big deal. Now, having said that, you know, green doesn't have great access to removal, so killing something like an opposing Shielded might be difficult, but I'm definitely going to be trying out mono green, and if it is viable, I imagine this card is definitely going to be a 4 of in the deck for sure. Then next up we've got Werefox Bodyguard, which is a really cool effect. So Brutal Cathar is going to be leaving the format with rotation, and I think this card is just better than Cathar. Like, having Flash on this sort of effect is so strong. You know, being able to blow out the opponent in combat at instant speed is a really, really big deal. Now, I think the biggest drawback of this card is the mana cost. You know, as I mentioned, multicolored decks are going to be a lot more difficult to build, and this having double white in the mana cost does make me think that it's probably only going to be viable in mono white, but if a mono white deck is viable, I definitely expect this card to be part of it for sure. And one thing that I missed when I brought this card up in my Historic and Explorer set review was that I didn't clock that it can also exile your own creatures, which is a pretty big deal because you can protect your best creature from a board sweeper, for example, like a Sunfall. And you can also do some, you know, cute tricks where, say you have a creature in play with an Enter the Battlefield ability, you can potentially flash this in, exile that creature, block with the Werefox Bodyguard, and then get the creature back with the Enter the Battlefield trigger again. So this card, I guess you don't even need to block because you can just sacrifice it to gain 2 life as well. So this card seems really good. You know, Brutal Cathar, already saw a decent amount of play in Alchemy in the past, and this card just seems way better. Again, I think the main sticking point is whether mono white is viable or not, but if it is, I definitely expect this card to be a part of that deck for sure. And next up, we got Gadwick's First Duel, which is a really interesting option for the Dimir control deck, because Chapter 1 basically turns any creature into a 1/1, which is obviously sick when you're running a Bowmaster's deck, right? If you are running blue-black control, being able to turn a Shieldred or any other big creature into a 1/1 that you can just snipe with Bowmasters seems really good. Then you get to scry on Chapter 2 and double up your value of your instants and sorceries of Chapter 3 as well. So again, it'll be interesting to see if this sees play over stuff like Go for the Throat, or just, generic removal in general. The downside of it is that typically I think Dimir Control does want to be playing at instant speed a lot of the time, and this is a sorcery speed card, but and the other thing is that the opponent still gets the passive abilities of their creatures. So if you have this and you don't have a Bowmasters, turning the opponent's Shieldred into a 1/1 doesn't really do all that much because they still get the passive ability on it. So there are definitely some pros and cons of running this, but it's definitely an interesting option for those Dimir decks for sure. So next up, we've got the land cycle that I was talking about earlier. So in this set, we're going to be getting all of the enemy coloured pairs like red-white here are going to be getting tapped dual lands that also double up as creature lands, which is quite interesting. Now, I'm not going to go through all of them because I do think they're going to see play, but I think they're probably more going to see play out of necessity than anything else. I'm generally not very high on tap lands. I think tap lands, even though they do double up as creature lands, are only really good in slower decks like Control, really. But I think if you're running an enemy coloured deck, in two colours like red-white, for example, you'll probably just have to run this just to meet your colour requirements. So I do expect these to see play, and I do think that the creature land ability is pretty reasonable on some of them, but I think they're more going to see play out of necessity than anything else, if that makes sense. Then next up, we got the Goose Mother, which is a really interesting card. It's kind of reminiscent of Hydroid Krasis a little bit. And I think, first of all, this card seems really good if you have food synergies going on. Now, I'm not sure this is really going to see play in a specifically food deck, because I think the best things you can be doing with food are the Confectioner Peregrine combo, or something with Samwise Gamgee, both of which are in off colours, and I really don't think you're going to be able to consistently run a 3-colour deck. Could be wrong about that, maybe, but I think if this does see play, it's probably going to see play in a ramp deck more than anything else. I don't think you need to have other food synergies, because this card kind of does just enable itself. You make the food tokens when it enters play, and then you can just stack them to draw cards. So if there is a ramp deck, and splashing blue isn't too much of a restriction, it is an enemy coloured, so again, you might have to be running the creature land to enable it, but this does seem like a reasonably good payoff for ramping. Again, mono green might be better because of the mana situation, but definitely a generically powerful card. Just not sure it's got a really great home, if that makes sense. And the next up, we've got Rowan, Scion of War, which seems like a really interesting card in black-red ring decks. So the ability on this to reduce the cost of your cards for the amount of life you've lost this turn seems really interesting alongside the One Ring, right? Because you're obviously going to be taking damage off the One Ring every single turn. So, having this in play, then going into the One Ring, and then just tapping this to reduce the cost of the cards enables you to cast all the cards that you draw from your hand pretty easily, which is pretty nice. And then obviously, we've got the Pain lands in the format as well, so that's another way that you can consistently enable this. Now, again, my hesitation about this card, specifically in that sort of shell, is that once you have the One Ring going, you're probably going to be winning anyway, so this might be a little bit too win more, if that makes sense, but I'm sure there are some other cards that cause you to lose life in the format that I've missed out on that could synergize pretty nicely with this card, and there's also a chance that the format does resolve, break down into these sort of One Ring mirror matches, and the person who can cast their spells more efficiently might end up getting ahead. So this is definitely an interesting option for Rakdos decks, specifically if you are running the One Ring. So I'm definitely going to be trying it out. I definitely think it has potential, but again, I think there's a chance it could be a little bit too win more as well. Then next up, we've got Questing Druid, which is a very, very generically powerful card. Reckless Impulse and Ren's Resolve are both cards that see play even in Eternal formats in certain decks. And while I don't think Seek the Beast on the adventure side of this is quite as good as those cards, because Ren's Resolve, Reckless Impulse, you can cast the cards you exile until the end of your next turn, whereas this is just for, until your next end step. But the fact that it's instant kind of gets around that a little bit, right? You can cast this during the opponent's turn and then still cast the cards you hit off exile during your turn as well. And then the creature seems just a generically powerful threat as well. Now, obviously it's a 1/1 in the Bowmasters format, but it outscales Bowmasters almost immediately, so as long as you have something else to cast, you can get this out of range. Now, I think the biggest issue with this card is that I just can't really think of a great home for it, to be honest. Now, red-green does have access to the fast lands, so there is a chance that a red-green low to the ground deck would be interested in this. Now, the thing is, I think you do need to be running a low to the ground deck for this card to be effective, because you need to be able to cast this in the early game and then consistently cast whatever you exile. So you'd probably need to be a low to the ground aggro deck of some sort. Not 100% sure what that would look like. So again, I think this is just a generically powerful card that probably doesn't have an immediate great home, but it's definitely one bearing in mind going forwards, because I think it's definitely one of the most powerful cards in the format. Just doesn't really have a great home right now. Then next up, we've got two cards that I'm interested in go wide Selesnya decks, and that is Regal Bunnicorn and Pollen-Shield Hare. So these are both very, very powerful cards if you can go wide. And I was brewing a deck around these two cards with Ropeline Attendant, which I think is one of the most underplayed cards in Alchemy right now. But unfortunately, I didn't realize that Ropeline Attendant is going to be one of those cards that's going to be rotating, which is a bit of a hit, because that is definitely one of the best token enablers in the format. Now, having said that, there are still a decent number of tools that enable you to go wide. The issue is that a lot of them are 1 toughness, so die to Bowmasters, but I think Bunnicorn and the Pollen-Shield Hare are good enough payoffs for a token strategy that it definitely seems worth trying, as long as we can find enough token enablers for this. Again, with Ropeline Attendant rotating, maybe we don't have enough pieces for this to be good, but we typically get token enablers in most sets, so as more sets are added to the format, this is definitely one that I'm going to be keeping my eye on as more cards get added to the format. Then next up, we've got Agatha's Soul Cauldron, which is a little bit lower down on this list than it was in Historic, just because I can't really find an immediate really good home for it. Now, this is a generically very powerful card that kind of acts as graveyard hate, that can buff your board and give your creatures extra value as well. Now, again, unlike Historic, where we have immediate good homes for it, like Kethis, for example, I have been struggling to find a good creature or a good home for this, but, it's at its flaw, it's slightly slower graveyard hate than Unlicensed Hearse that buffs your own creatures, and with Unlicensed Hearse leaving the format, there's a chance that this just could be the graveyard hate of choice that also has a ton of upside. And then if you can also just find a good home for it where you can have good creatures in your graveyard to buff your other creatures, this seems like a really good option as well. So I do expect this card to see a lot of play. I just can't quite think of the best home for it. So this is definitely one where I'd love to hear in the comments if you have a good synergy with this card in Alchemy, because it definitely seems like it has potential for sure. The next up, we've got Thunderous Debut, which is another card that I don't think has a great home right now. I think for this to be good, you really need to be cheating this into play somehow. I've seen some people use it with Fight Rigging in the standard early access, which seems like a really cool synergy. We do have Fight Rigging rotating though, so I think the biggest sticking point for this card is we just need a card that can cheat sorceries into play ahead of curve. If we can do that, this seems like a great payoff. Until we have that, I think 8 mana is just too expensive to play this fairly. The next up, we've got Witchstalker Frenzy, which is a really interesting option if aggro is popular. Again, I think if aggro is popular, it's probably going to be mono-coloured, and mono-red has traditionally been a good aggro deck in the past. Mono-red's biggest issue is dealing with bigger creatures like Shield Red, and this seems like a very good way to deal with it, right? You can attack them with your creatures, discount this down to 1 or 2 mana, and then just pick off the Shield Red to force through damage. So again, I'm not 100% sure if Mono Red will be good, because Bowmasters is very good against Mono Red typically, where they have creatures with low toughness. But if a Mono Red aggro deck is viable, I definitely expect this to be a nice option to be able to kill bigger creatures for sure. Then next up, we've got the End, which is a really interesting generic removal spell. Now, I'm very high on this one in Historic because there's a lot of combo decks floating about, and I think if the Ratadrabbic combo still sticks about, this could be a good option, particularly in Beseech the Mirror decks, but I generally think that stuff like Pylon is probably a better option for 4 mana generic removal, but as I mentioned, if combo decks do stick around, I do think this is a potential option, especially if you're running Beseech the Mirror as kind of like a flexible card that you can use to shut off the opponent's combo. The next one, we've got Virtue of Persistence, which is another reasonable reanimation card. The big difference with this is that it also has the removal spell tacked on, so obviously 7 mana for this reanimation effect is very, very overcosted, but 2 mana, piece of interaction that gives a creature -3/-3 and gains you 2 life isn't the worst, right? I've seen Lolian see play in some decks. Now, there is obviously an instant as opposed to a sorcery, but if you are running some sort of reanimator strategy, this works really nicely because it's just very flexible in your deck, right? It does give you early interaction that then doubles up as an enchantment. I do think how good this card is really depends on the sorcery side, though. If it not being instant speed is a big drawback, and if a lot of creatures are outscaling the -3/-3, like Shieldred, then this probably isn't good enough. But if this does hit the majority of creatures that are played in the format, I do think this one has a chance in reanimated strategies. The next up, we got Farsight Ritual, which is basically a worse copy of Memory Deluge, but Deluge is rotating, so if you're interested in more card advantage spells in your blue control decks, this is an option. Again, we've still got Sauron's Ransom, which is probably the better card, but if you want another Memory Deluge style effect, this is definitely one to bear in mind. Similarly for the control decks, you've also got Horned Loch-Whale, which is a really interesting card that is a pretty efficient removal spell for 2 mana that also doubles up as a finisher, which is really nice. You know, specifically if you want to run a very interactive heavy deck, having your removal spell double up as a finisher, like we kind of saw with Kaleem, which is also another card that's rotating, this seems like a very nice option. So if control is viable, I definitely wouldn't be surprised to see this one see play there as well. Speaking of which, we've also got another counterspell for the control decks in Ice Out, which is, 3 mana generic removal spell that we can discount to 2 if we can bargain it. So a little bit reminiscent of Make Disappear, definitely worse than Make Disappear, but if you are running a deck with a lot of bargain enablers, obviously Bowmasters is a good one if you're running blue-black, for example, although needing double blue and black on turn 2 is a little rough with the mana-based situation, but this definitely seems like a reasonable option. If you're running a control deck that can also enable bargain, this seems like a really good option there as well. Then we've also got Sleight of Hand, which is definitely notable because it's a cantrip that doesn't draw you a card. I think decks that rely on cantrips like Consider have become a lot worse with the prominence of Bowmasters in the format. So if you are a deck that wants to run cantrips, so probably an Izzet deck, then having Sleight of Hand that doesn't trigger Bowmasters or Shieldred seems like a nice option there. Again, not sure if Izzet is going to be good, but this is definitely a nice option for those Spellslinger style decks. Then next up we got Spellbook Vendor, which is not a very flashy card, but I think it is pretty reasonable on rate. I think humans as a deck did get really punished by Bowmasters in general, and they are losing a lot of reasonable cards, like I think Thalia and Sigardian Evangel are going to be rotating, as is Adeline, so I'm not sure that I'm not sure that humans is really going to be a viable archetype, but if mono white aggro is, with stuff like that, the Werefox that we saw earlier, I do think Spellbook Vendor is pretty reasonable on rate. It's a kind of reminiscent of Luminarch Aspirant. It is definitely worse because you have to invest mana in it every single turn, but Aspirant was a very, very good card. This is, kind of reminiscent, and also has Vigilance as well, which isn't nothing. So if mono white aggro is a viable deck, this definitely could be a reasonable addition there as well. And then finally, I've also got some Faerie cards. So as I mentioned, Make Disappear is going to be rotating. We do have another Quench style effect in Spell Stutter that does get better with Fairies in play. Now, I'm not really sure this is going to be that great. Make Disappear is a lot better than Quench because of the upside. This is obviously better than Quench as well because of the potential upside, but I'm not really sure Fairies is going to cut it. I think the best Faerie is this Sleep Cursed Faerie for sure, but most of the other Fairies that I've seen are either 1 toughness, so they die to Bowmasters, which is really rough, or the 3 mana kind of, not really the Lord, but there's a 3 mana card that gives you a bonus whenever you attack with Fairies, but that also involves drawing cards as well. So I fear that Fairies as an archetype isn't really going to be good enough while Bowmasters is around, but I wanted to mention these anyway because there's also Fairy Fencing, which seems like a very nice payoff for being in Fairies as well. So with the Fairies that we've seen in this set, I don't think that deck is going to be good enough to see play in Alchemy, but if they release Fairies, extra Fairies in future sets, I definitely think it's an archetype to keep an eye on because both Spell Stutter and Fairy Fencing are very nice payoffs if the creatures that support them are good enough. So anyway, that's the set review. Those are the cards that I think are likely to see the most play. I'm really excited to get my hands on this set. I think it's definitely likely to have an impact in multiple formats. Obviously going to have a very big impact in Alchemy because of rotation. Definitely let me know in the comments what cards you're most excited for, what decks you're going to be brewing once the set drops, and also, as usual, definitely let me know in the comments if you think, firstly, there's any cards I missed out, or if there's any applications of the cards I spoke about that I didn't talk about either, because I'm sure there's some stuff that I've definitely missed in this. So either way, definitely let me know in the comments what you think of the set. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Big up!